Winter had learned her name before anyone else bothered to remember it. Snow pressed itself against the high windows of the council hall, soft as linen, relentless as judgment, muting the city beyond into a pale silence that felt deliberate. Inside, chandeliers burned with disciplined light, their crystals cold and immaculate, revealing every whisper that slid between silk sleeves and gloved fingers. She stood where she had been told to stand, not at the center, never that, but close enough to be seen, far enough to be spared the courtesy of welcome. The floor beneath her shoes held the chill of stone, rising through leather and bone, as if the building itself wished to test her resolve. Her name was spoken once, precisely once, and then it vanished, replaced by a word that carried more weight than any title. Barren. The syllables were not hurled, they were placed, as one might set down a sealed letter, confident of its contents. No one raised a voice. No one needed to. The verdict had ripened in corridors and drawing rooms for years, nurtured by calendars and cups of bitter tea, by physicians who avoided her eyes and husbands who avoided her bed. When the word reached her, it landed quietly, the way snow lands, covering what had been alive. She did not plead. Pleading would have implied that the matter belonged to her. Instead, she folded her hands, gloved and steady, and met the line of gazes without flinching. Her composure unsettled them more than tears would have. They had expected collapse, or at least a crack. What they received was stillness, polished by long practice. She had learned early how to stand within a storm and let it pass through her without permission. Across the hall, the men who mattered spoke of legacy as if it were a coin already minted, discussing succession with the cool efficiency of merchants. They did not speak of her childhood, or of the winter illnesses that had thinned her breath, or of the prayers she had whispered into pillow linen when hope still seemed a reasonable habit. They spoke of continuity, of lines and branches, of the necessity of pruning. In their language, she was not a woman but an interruption. The decree arrived dressed as mercy. She was to be sent north, beyond the iron forests and frozen rivers, to the Lycan sovereign whose dominion bordered the edge of maps and manners alike. The explanation was delivered with softened consonants, as if kindness could be smuggled into a sentence by tone alone. It would be an offering, they said, a gesture of balance between houses, a solution that spared everyone embarrassment. What they meant was exile, refined until it gleamed. At the mention of the Lycan, a hush threaded the hall. Stories moved faster than snow there, curling around hearths and under doors, tales of a ruler more wolf than man, older than treaties, bound to winter the way blood is bound to the heart. She had heard them all, usually from mouths that smiled afterward, pleased by their own bravery. In those stories, women did not return. Or if they did, they returned as silence. Her escort waited outside, boots ringing faintly against stone, the sound a metronome marking the end of her former life. She turned once, not to search for allies but to memorize the room that had decided her worth. The chandeliers, the banners, the faces carved by expectation. She would carry them with her, not as burdens but as proof. Then she walked, each step a small refusal to be diminished. The carriage was black and unadorned, its iron fittings already furred with frost. When the door closed, the city exhaled her, and the road took over, rutted and white, stretching toward a horizon that refused familiarity. Snow fell in earnest now, thickening the air until the world reduced itself to motion and breath. Inside the carriage, she removed her gloves and pressed her palms together, warming skin against skin. She allowed herself a single tremor, brief and private, and then she stilled it, ashamed not of fear but of the relief that followed it. There is a strange comfort in being done with hope. Night claimed the land early. Lantern light swung, casting long shadows that climbed the trees like animals testing their reach. The farther they traveled, the quieter the world became, as if sound itself had been warned away. She slept in fragments, waking to the rhythm of hooves and the memory of rooms where she had once been measured and found wanting. In those rooms, mirrors had been generous, time had not. At dawn, the forest opened, and the Lycan stronghold revealed itself without ceremony. Stone rose from the snow as if grown rather than built, walls dark, patient, bearing the marks of seasons no one remembered. Smoke threaded from narrow chimneys, the only sign of warmth. She felt the weight of being seen long before she saw anyone, a pressure like a held breath. The carriage slowed. The world waited. She stepped down into snow that reached her ankles, the cold sharp enough to demand attention. Her escort did not announce her. He did not need to. From the shadows between the towers, eyes watched, amber and unblinking, not hostile, not welcoming, simply aware. She lifted her chin, the old reflex of dignity asserting itself even here, even now. Whatever they expected to find, it would not be a woman already broken. The wind shifted, carrying with it the clean, feral scent of pine and ash, and she understood that reputation was a language here, spoken without tongues. Every lesson learned in salons and sickrooms rearranged itself, not discarded but sharpened, repurposed for survival. She had been trained to endure glances, now she endured quiet. She had been taught to wait for permission, now she waited for nothing. Somewhere within the fortress, metal rang and then fell silent, a heartbeat she felt in her wrists. The Lycan's stillness did not threaten, it weighed, as mountains weigh, by existing. In that weight, her shame thinned, stretched until it could no longer bind her. She was no longer a verdict traveling north, no longer an offering wrapped in civility. She was a woman standing in winter, unclaimed, unafraid, and finally, undeniably present. The snow listened, and the walls remembered her. The gate opened with a sound like an answer withheld too long. Beyond it, a courtyard lay quiet, firelight glimmering against iron and stone. And there, at the far end, stood a figure unmoving, wrapped in a dark cloak that drank the light. He did not advance. He did not bow. He regarded her as winter regards a flame, with interest that does not hurry. In that measured gaze, she felt the finality of what had been done to her, and, beneath it, something else, unsettled and unnamed. The past loosened its grip by a fraction. Snow fell between them, stitching the distance closed one breath at a time. She crossed the threshold, and the gate sealed behind her, leaving her suspended in a silence that promised either ending or beginning, and refused to say which. Snow did not retreat when she crossed into the Lycan's domain, it reorganized itself around her, as if the land were deciding how closely to hold her. The courtyard remained still after the gate sealed, the sound echoing once, then settling into the stone like a final word. No voice announced her presence. No hand gestured her forward. Silence here was not absence but custom, an etiquette older than bows. She waited, breath measured, aware of every place where cold touched skin, of the way the air seemed to test her resolve before granting passage. The Lycan sovereign watched without disguise. His cloak was dark enough to erase its own edges, fur-lined at the collar, heavy with frost. He stood neither tall nor relaxed, but anchored, as if the ground itself had decided to rise into a man. His face held no cruelty, no welcome either, only a stillness sharpened by long authority. When he spoke her name, it was not a question. It was recognition, and the sound of it struck her with unexpected force. She had been named all her life, but never like this, never as if the syllables carried weight enough to endure. "You will come inside," he said, voice low, unhurried, shaped by the cold. It was not an order, though it carried the certainty of one. She inclined her head, a gesture refined by years of compliance, and followed. As she walked, she felt the eyes again, not the gawking curiosity of courts but the quiet accounting of creatures who knew precisely what they guarded. Firelight spilled from the entryway, amber and alive, and when she crossed that threshold, warmth gathered around her shoulders like a question she did not yet know how to answer. The hall beyond was vast without being ornate. Stone walls bore the marks of age, not neglect, and banners hung plain, their symbols abstract, their colors muted by smoke and time. The scent of pine resin and iron threaded the air. She noticed what was absent as keenly as what was present: no portraits of wives, no line of heirs frozen in paint, no trophies proclaiming conquest. This was not a place built to impress, but to endure. That realization unsettled her more than splendor would have. Servants appeared and vanished without sound, relieving her of cloak and travel-worn layers. She expected scrutiny, perhaps dismissal, but none came. Instead, she was guided to a chamber where a fire burned steady and low, its heat coaxing stiffness from her hands. The Lycan remained near the door, not looming, not withdrawing. Distance here felt deliberate, a courtesy that acknowledged both her vulnerability and his power. He gestured to the hearth, and she sat, posture straight, the habits of dignity intact even as exhaustion tugged at her bones. "You have been sent," he said at last. The statement held no accusation, only fact. She met his gaze, surprised by how easily she could do so now, in this quieter light. "I was," she answered. "For being insufficient." The word tasted familiar, bitter, and controlled. She did not dress it in explanation. She had learned the futility of that. A flicker crossed his expression then, so brief she might have imagined it. Not anger. Not pity. Something closer to disdain, but not for her. He turned slightly, as if addressing the fire rather than her, and spoke with a restraint that suggested long practice. "My lands are not a repository for society's refusals." "I know," she said. "Nor did I ask to come." Silence settled again, but it had shifted. It no longer pressed, it listened. The Lycan regarded her anew, not as cargo but as presence. When he spoke next, his voice carried a subtle emphasis, a recalibration. "You will stay until the winter breaks. You will not be harmed. You will not be claimed. That is my word." The words struck her harder than condemnation ever had. Not be claimed. She had not realized how tightly she had braced for that inevitability, how deeply the stories had carved their warnings into her expectations. Relief came sharp and unwanted, threatening to crack the careful composure she wore like armor. She nodded once, trusting herself with nothing more. Days unfolded in a rhythm she had not known existed. She was given space, but not neglect. Meals arrived warm and balanced, not indulgent, not sparse. No one asked her for gratitude. No one demanded performance. The Lycan did not summon her, yet his presence threaded the halls, felt rather than seen. Sometimes she sensed him near the windows at night, watching the forest as if it were an extension of his own thoughts. Sometimes she heard his voice in counsel, low and decisive, carrying through stone. Each time, she felt a curious steadiness settle in her chest, an unfamiliar sense of being accounted for without being weighed. Outside the stronghold, rumor fermented. Messengers came and went, their cloaks dusted with snow and gossip. Whispers reached her through the servants' careful silences, through the way eyes lingered and then looked away. They wondered why she still lived untouched. They wondered what debt had been struck, what bargain hidden. In the south, where chandeliers still burned and judgments still ripened, her absence became a provocation. The woman sent to the Lycan had not disappeared. She had been absorbed, and the difference frightened them. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the first stars struggled through cloud, the Lycan presented her with a cloak. It was simple, dark wool lined with fur, cut to her frame without ostentation. He offered it without ceremony, laying it across the back of a chair. "The cold deepens," he said. "You will need this." She understood the weight of the gesture immediately. Gifts were languages in her former world, each thread stitched with implication. She hesitated, then reached out, fingers brushing the fabric. It was warm already, as if it had been waiting for her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, even as caution flared. The cloak did not go unnoticed. By morning, the whispers sharpened into something like scandal. They said she had been marked. They said she was being prepared. They said the Lycan's mercy was a performance, a prelude. She heard these things and learned something essential. Reputation traveled faster than truth, but truth, once rooted, did not need to hurry. She wore the cloak anyway, its weight a comfort she refused to surrender. The Lycan spoke to her again by the fire, later than custom, the hall empty but for them. "They will not stop," he said, as if continuing a conversation begun elsewhere. "Fear breeds noise. I am familiar with noise, she replied. It has never asked my permission. He studied her then, openly this time, not as a curiosity but as a question worth the asking. You are quieter than they expect. They mistook silence for emptiness, she said, and felt the truth of it resonate deeper than she had intended. Outside, wolves howled, a sound neither threat nor lament, but declaration. The Lycan turned toward it, listening, and for a moment, his stillness softened, revealing the strain of vigilance beneath. She saw then the cost of his sovereignty, the solitude it demanded, and something in her shifted, subtle and irrevocable. They were both, in different ways, figures pressed into roles by others' expectations. When she retired that night, the fire dimmed low, she stood at the window, the cloak wrapped close, watching snow erase tracks as quickly as they were made. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued its judgments, confident and cruel. Here, in this measured quiet, a different reckoning waited. She did not know its shape yet, only that it would not resemble the ending written for her. Below, in the courtyard, the Lycan paused, looking up once, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes did not meet, but awareness did, stretching between stone and glass, fragile and undeniable. Winter tightened its hold, and in that tightening, the first real question of her fate finally began to form. Night reshaped the stronghold into something more intimate, drawing shadows close and letting firelight do the work of memory. Snow pressed against the windows in soft, persistent taps, as if the world beyond were asking permission to exist. She sat near the hearth, hands ungloved, palms open to the warmth, watching the flames bend and recover. Winter had slowed her thoughts, stripped them of urgency, leaving only what endured. It was in this quiet that he came, not announced, not dramatic, simply present, as though the stone itself had decided to speak. He did not sit at once. He stood opposite her, the fire outlining his figure in copper and shadow, his expression unreadable but attentive. Silence gathered, dense yet careful, the kind that did not rush to be filled. She sensed that this moment had weight, not imposed but chosen, and that realization steadied her spine more than any practiced grace. When he finally lowered himself onto the bench across from her, the distance between them remained exact, deliberate, like the measured space between truths. You are colder than you admit, he said, eyes on her hands. It was not reproach. It was observation, precise and unexpected. I have been colder, she replied. The answer surprised them both. She had not intended honesty, yet it emerged intact, unadorned. He inclined his head, accepting it without comment, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease, just slightly. The fire shifted, releasing a sigh of sparks. He rested his forearms on his knees, posture neither defensive nor casual, and regarded the flames as if they were a language he had learned young. They called you Barren, he said, not as a rumor but as a fact carried here on the same winds that bore snow. The word hovered between them, familiar and dangerous. Yes. She did not look away. They decided it long before they told me. Her voice remained level, though memory tugged at it, trying to fray its edges. I was examined, corrected, prayed over. Years passed. The fault never shifted. He was silent for a long moment, and she felt the old reflex rise, the urge to soften, to excuse herself, to make the wound smaller so others might bear it. She resisted. This was not a room that demanded performance. At last, he spoke. In my world, time does not move as yours does. Blood does not answer to calendars. It listens to other things. She frowned, not in doubt but in curiosity sharpened by restraint. That is a luxury, she said quietly. To wait without being judged. It is not always luxury, he replied. Sometimes it is sentence. His gaze lifted then, meeting hers fully, and something unguarded flickered there, quickly mastered. Lycan blood is governed by cycles older than law. Union without alignment yields nothing. Union with it yields abundance. The word settled into her slowly. Abundance had never belonged to her vocabulary of self. She had learned moderation, patience, the art of wanting less. Her breath caught despite her efforts. They told me my body had failed, she said. That it was empty. Bodies are rarely empty, he said, with a certainty that did not seek argument. They are waiting, or wounded, or unheard. He paused, choosing his next words with care that felt like respect. Your presence here is not punishment. It is not bargain. It is circumstance intersecting with choice. The fire cracked, sharp as punctuation. She absorbed his words, letting them rearrange the architecture of her understanding. Choice. No one had offered her that in years, not honestly. And what choice do you believe I have? She asked. That you remain yourself, he said. Unclaimed. And used. Seen. The last word carried weight enough to press against her ribs. And that I do not allow their ignorance to define you within my walls. Emotion rose, swift and traitorous, tightening her throat. She had been defended before, in theory, in politeness, in abstract assurances that never materialized when tested. This defense was different. It did not elevate her. It cleared space around her. She lowered her eyes, not in submission, but to gather herself. You speak as if you know me. I know what they tried to make of you, he said. That is not the same. The distinction mattered more than she expected. Silence returned, altered again, now threaded with something fragile and alive. Outside, the wolves answered one another, their calls layered, communal, a sound of belonging that stirred something painful and hopeful in her chest. She stood, suddenly restless, drawn to the window, and he rose as well, though he remained behind her, respectful of the boundary she had not spoken. They sent me here to disappear, she said, watching snow erase the world. To become a story they could end conveniently. Her reflection wavered in the glass, firelight and shadow splitting her face into past and present. I do not intend to vanish. I would not permit it, he said simply. She turned then, meeting his eyes, and in that moment the distance between them shifted, not closed, but acknowledged. She saw in him not the monster of rumor nor the savior of fantasy, but a ruler burdened by restraint, a man bound to his nature as tightly as she had been bound to judgment. Understanding moved between them, quiet and irrevocable. Neither reached out. Neither needed to. When he left her that night, the room felt altered, as if the walls had leaned in to listen and would remember what they had heard. Sleep came unevenly, threaded with images of fire and snow, of words that refused to settle into certainty. In the days that followed, she noticed changes too subtle for announcement, warmth that lingered longer in her hands, a steadiness in her step, a sense of being oriented towards something rather than away from everything. Servants watched her differently now, not with suspicion but with curiosity edged by respect. She felt it herself first, the shift, so slight she almost dismissed it. A faint hum beneath her skin, a deepening awareness, as if some inner rhythm had adjusted its pace. She told no one. She observed, as she had learned to do, cataloging sensation without claim. Yet when she passed the Lycan in the hall and their eyes met, his gaze lingered, sharpened by something new. Recognition, perhaps, or caution. Winter pressed on, fierce and unyielding, but within her, something had begun to answer it, not with fear, but with quiet preparation. One evening, standing again by the hearth, she rested a hand against her abdomen, more instinct than intent, and felt a warmth there that had nothing to do with fire. She closed her eyes, breath shallow, the implications unfurling slowly, dangerously. Outside, the wolves fell silent, as if listening. And in that hush, she understood that the question of her fate had shifted into something far more perilous than exile, something that would not remain hidden for long. Winter tightened its grip as if it sensed what was unfolding and meant to bear witness. Snow fell heavier now, not in drifting courtesy but in thick, decisive sheets that blurred distance and softened edges. Days shortened until light felt rationed, a precious commodity measured in hours rather than hope. Within the stronghold, fire burned longer, and voices lowered instinctively, as though stone and flame alike understood that something unnamed had entered their keeping. She felt it with a clarity that frightened her. Not certainty, not yet, but a gathering. Her body no longer felt like neutral ground. It felt purposeful, alert, as if listening inward for instructions written in a language she was only beginning to recognize. Each morning, she woke before the bells, breath caught somewhere between dread and wonder, palms pressed lightly to her abdomen as though guarding a secret from the air itself. She told herself to be cautious, to remember the long years of disappointment, the false dawns that had ended in silence. Still, the warmth persisted, patient and undeniable. The Lycan noticed before she spoke a word. He always did. He watched the way she moved more slowly now, the way she paused on stair landings not from weakness but from awareness. He listened to the cadence of her breath when she spoke, to the subtle shifts that betrayed change long before proof arrived. Yet he said nothing at first. Restraint was his oldest discipline, and he would not violate it for speculation, not even this. Their conversations grew fewer, but deeper, carried by glances and measured silences rather than speech. When they did speak, it was with an attentiveness that felt ceremonial, as though each word were being weighed for consequence. He asked no questions about her body. She offered no confessions. Between them lay a shared understanding that some truths required patience to survive revelation. Outside the stronghold, patience was not a virtue. Rumors hardened into accusations, sharpened by fear of what could not be controlled. Messengers arrived from the south bearing letters sealed with wax and resentment, their words cloaked in civility but heavy with demand. They asked why she remained. They asked what right she had to linger within Lycan walls. They asked, finally, whether the stories were true. The Lycan answered none of them. Silence, he knew, could be both shield and warning. When the first sign became impossible to dismiss, it arrived without spectacle. She faltered once in the corridor, hand braced against cold stone, breath shallow and sharp. A servant moved to help, but she waved them away, pride flaring uselessly. It was the Lycan who steadied her, his hand firm at her elbow, his touch respectful yet charged with awareness. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that contact, to the quiet certainty in his grip. "You must sit," he said, not as command but as care. She did. The fire crackled nearby, scenting the air with resin and iron. For a long moment, she stared into the flames, gathering the courage she had been denied for years. Then she spoke, voice low, controlled, but threaded with something perilously close to hope. "Something has changed." His eyes did not leave her face. "I know." The simplicity of his answer undid her more than questions would have. Tears threatened, uninvited and unwelcome, and she blinked them back with practiced precision. "I am afraid to believe it," she admitted. "I have been wrong before." "Fear does not negate truth," he said. "It prepares us to protect it." When confirmation came, it came quietly, delivered by one of his own, a Lycan healer whose eyes held both wisdom and awe. The woman spoke in measured tones, reverent without indulgence, explaining what had been sensed, what had been waiting. "Not one life," she said. "More." The words settled slowly, staggering in their implication. Multiplicity. Legacy. Continuance beyond anything the southern courts had ever imagined. She sat very still as the meaning unfurled, hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. "9," the healer said, her voice hushed, as though afraid to startle fate itself. 9 heartbeats, aligned, answering one another. A phenomenon rare even among Lycan lines, unheard of beyond them. The room seemed to tilt, reality recalibrating itself around that number. When they were alone again, she finally allowed the truth to surface, raw and trembling. "They said I was empty," she whispered. The words broke despite her resolve. "They sent me away to erase their mistake." He knelt before her then, not in submission, but in solidarity, lowering himself until their eyes met on equal ground. "They were wrong," he said, each syllable deliberate. "And they will be forced to understand the cost of that error." The declaration carried weight beyond promise. It was not vengeance he offered, but reckoning. She felt it settle into her bones, steadying rather than inflaming. For the first time, the future did not feel like an accusation waiting to be proven false. It felt like terrain she might cross with purpose. Winter intensified as if in response. Storms battered the stronghold, wind howling through stone corridors like a living thing. Fires burned day and night, and the wolves circled closer, guardians drawn inward by instinct older than oath. Her condition became known within the walls, not through proclamation but through reverent attention. She was no longer watched out of curiosity, but out of care. Paths were cleared before her. Voices softened. The stronghold adjusted its rhythm to hers without being asked. The Lycan convened his council at last, the ancient chamber lit by torches that cast long, shifting shadows. He spoke plainly, without ornament or apology. He named her not as guest, not as offering, but as protected under his word. He spoke of heirs without numbering them, of legacy without spectacle. The council listened, some with awe, others with unease, all with understanding that this declaration could not be undone. Word traveled faster after that. It always did once truth gained momentum. Beyond the forests and frozen rivers, the south stirred uneasily. The woman they had cast out had not vanished. She had become something they could neither reclaim nor ignore. Whispers grew panicked, then furious. They spoke of manipulation, of deception, of unnatural fortune. None of it mattered. The narrative had shifted beyond their reach. She felt the strain of that shift keenly. Nights grew restless, her sleep fractured by dreams vivid with motion and sound, 9 presences moving within her awareness like a constellation rearranging itself. The Lycan stayed nearby during those hours, not intruding, simply present, his steadiness a counterweight to the storm inside and out. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they shared silence thick with meaning. Each night, the bond between them deepened, not forged by passion, but by vigilance. As the winter solstice approached, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Snow fell uninterrupted, erasing roads, isolating the stronghold from the world it had defied. Within those walls, anticipation coiled tight, tempered by fear. She understood now that her survival was no longer the only stake. The lives she carried bound her to a destiny vast and unforgiving, one that would demand everything she had learned to endure. On the longest night, she stood at the window, cloak wrapped close, watching darkness press against the glass. The Lycan joined her without a word, his presence solid, anchoring. She rested her hand against her abdomen again, this time without hesitation, and felt movement answer her touch, deliberate and strong. Her breath caught, awe-eclipsing fear at last. "They will come," she said softly, not asking who. "The world does not forgive being proven wrong." He followed her gaze into the storm. "Let them," he replied. "Winter favors those who endure." Beyond the walls, thunder rolled beneath snow, a rare and ominous sound. She closed her eyes, drawing a careful breath, understanding that what waited ahead would not be gentle, nor would it be hidden. The children she carried were already reshaping the balance of power, and the first true test of that change was approaching, swift and inevitable, carried on the storm. Snow fell as if the sky itself were shedding history, each flake erasing a former judgment as it touched stone and flame. Inside the stronghold, time narrowed to breath and heartbeat, to the slow vigilance of women who had learned how to wait without surrender. She labored through the longest night of winter, pain rising and receding like a tide that refused retreat, her resolve forged moment by moment rather than granted by mercy. The Lycan remained near, not as ruler or sentinel, but as witness, his presence steady enough to anchor the room when cries fractured the air. He did not touch her unless asked, did not command unless needed, and in that restraint she found strength she had never been permitted to claim. With each hour, the storm outside howled louder, wolves answering one another across the frozen hills as if announcing an arrival written into the marrow of the world. When the first child was born, silence followed the cry, a collective pause where fear and wonder exchanged places. Then came the second, and the third, each arrival reshaping expectation, each small life answering the next with impossible precision. The healer's voice trembled despite her discipline, counting softly not from uncertainty but reverence. By the fifth birth, the stronghold itself seemed to breathe differently, torches burning brighter, stone warmed by something deeper than fire. By the seventh, the Lycan bowed his head, not in relief but recognition, understanding that legacy had chosen its moment. When the ninth cry pierced the night, dawn answered it, pale light cutting through storm clouds as if summoned by blood itself. She lay spent and trembling, surrounded by proof no one could deny, tears slipping free at last not from pain but release. The Lycan moved then, kneeling beside her, his composure finally breaking into something raw and human. "You endured what they could not imagine," he said quietly, voice unsteady with truth rather than triumph. She looked at him through exhaustion and wonder, and for the first time, she did not feel defined by survival alone. Morning spread across the courtyard, revealing 9 lives swaddled in fur and linen, watched over by a ruler who had become something more. News traveled despite snow and sealed roads, carried by fear, awe, and the undeniable weight of fact. In southern halls, those who had condemned her read the reports in silence, their certainty collapsing under numbers and names. They spoke of omens, of unnatural intervention, of errors that could not be undone. But no argument could erase 9 heartbeats, no decree could exile a truth already born. Within the stronghold, she recovered slowly, learning again how to inhabit her body without fear. He visited often, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply sitting, understanding that presence was now the most faithful form of protection. Together they faced the future without illusion, aware that power invites challenge as surely as winter invites storm. Yet she no longer feared judgment, because judgment had lost its authority over her name. As the children slept, their breaths aligned like quiet promises, she understood the final shape of her transformation. They had sent her away to end a story, and instead, she had become the beginning of one that would outlast them all. The Lycan stood at the threshold as dawn strengthened, 9 heirs secured within walls no longer merely ancient, but renewed. He knew the world beyond the snow would not remain still, and neither would he. The future gathered its breath, waiting to see who would dare cross the winter to challenge what had been born. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the living proof around her, knowing that the first battle was over, and others would follow. But whatever came next would meet a woman no longer shaped by exile, but by endurance turned luminous. The storm eased as if conceding defeat, leaving behind a silence thick with possibility and warning. She knew peace would be brief, but she welcomed even its short embrace. For the first time, she did not need to be believed to exist. The Lycan met her gaze once more, a vow unspoken yet absolute passing between them. In the distance, a horn sounded from the southern pass, faint but real, carried by the cold. She opened her eyes, understanding that the world was already moving toward them, and the next chapter would demand everything they were willing to become. The children stirred, 9 separate motions weaving into one quiet testament, and she smiled despite the ache in her bones. Beyond the walls, banners would rise and fall, alliances would fracture, and bloodlines would be measured against hers. She accepted that burden without resentment, because it was chosen rather than imposed. The Lycan straightened, already calculating defenses and declarations, yet his eyes softened when they returned to her. Between strategy and tenderness, they found balance, a shared resolve forged not in conquest but care. The dawn fully broke, revealing a sky scrubbed clean, as if the night had been allowed to end at last. She held on to that image, knowing darkness would return, but never again in the same form. The horn sounded again, closer now, cutting through morning calm like a blade. The Lycan turned toward the sound, his expression sharpening, duty calling him forward. She watched him go, not with fear, but with certainty rooted deep as winter itself. Behind her, 9 lives slept, unaware that the world was already arranging itself in response to their existence. She drew a steady breath, preparing for the reckoning to come, and did not falter. The stronghold stood ready, and so did she. Whatever armies or accusations crossed the snow, they would meet a truth too large to be undone. The winter that had once been her sentence had become her shield. And in that transformation, she claimed a power no one could exile again. The horn fell silent, leaving behind a tension that promised swift consequence. She turned back to the children, resolve settling fully into place. This was no longer a story of survival alone, but of inheritance and defiance entwined. The world would test them, and they would answer. She straightened, strength returning with clarity, and waited for what winter would send next. The Lycan's footsteps echoed distantly, steady and unyielding. Above the stronghold, clouds shifted, revealing a thin blade of sun. It was enough. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, then opened them, ready. The future advanced through snow and silence, and she would not retreat. 9 breaths rose behind her, and the world waited. So did winter. And it would learn, as they all would, that she was no longer alone. The story did not end there, but it had reached its turning. Beyond the snowbound horizon, consequences gathered their forces. She stood ready to meet them. Winter had chosen its queen, and the world would soon understand why. The snow kept falling, patient and unyielding. So did her resolve. The stronghold held its breath with her. Whatever came next would be answered in full. The reckoning approached, swift as dawn after storm. And she was ready. The world would soon test that truth. It would not fail.